Ed Sullivan never cried on television, not once in 16 years, not for 748 episodes, not in front of 73 million viewers. He'd interviewed presidents who wept, war heroes who broke down, families who'd lost everything. But Ed Sullivan himself? Never. Until February 16th, 1964, when an 8-year-old boy stepped out of the studio audience during a commercial break. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was holding a letter about his 6-year-old sister. What that boy said to Ed Sullivan and what Ed did next wasn't in the script. It wasn't approved by CBS. It stopped the show cold. And for 47 seconds of live broadcast, America watched the most controlled man on television completely surrender. Because sometimes the moments that break us are the only ones that reveal who we truly are. February 16, 1964 began like every other Sunday in the 16-year history of The Ed Sullivan Show. Studio 50 in Manhattan filled with its familiar pre-broadcast rhythm, the mechanical hum of television cameras moving into position, the shuffle of audience members finding their seats, the quiet urgency of stagehands checking microphones and adjusting stage lights for the 8th time that afternoon. Ed Sullivan stood backstage at exactly 7:45, reviewing his cue cards with the methodical precision that had made him America's most trusted television host. Tonight's show promised to be extraordinary, for one reason. The Beatles were returning for their second consecutive appearance, and the nation was still buzzing from their historic debut just 7 days earlier. 73 million Americans had watched that first performance, the largest television audience in history. Tonight, they'd be watching again. The lineup was pristine. Comedy sketches positioned perfectly between musical acts. A Broadway preview timed to the second. Animal performers who'd rehearsed their routines until every movement became instinct. And, of course, the Beatles, closing the show with 3 songs that would send teenage girls into hysterics and cement British invasion fever across the country. Everything had been planned, timed, and approved. Everything existed in its proper place. This was how Ed Sullivan operated. This was how live television survived. You controlled every variable. You anticipated every possibility. You maintained composure no matter what happened, because 8 o'clock on Sunday night belonged to American families gathering around their television sets, expecting predictability, excellence, and the comforting ritual of Ed Sullivan introducing the world's greatest performers with the same unflappable demeanor, whether he was speaking to opera legends or circus elephants. In 16 years and 748 episodes, Ed Sullivan had never lost control, not when technical failures threatened to derail broadcasts, not when performers missed their cues or animals escaped their handlers. Not even when President Kennedy's assassination forced him to completely redesign a show hours before airtime. Professional composure wasn't just Ed's trademark. It was his religion, his armor, his unbreakable rule. But sitting in the front row of that studio audience, completely unknown to Ed Sullivan or his production staff, sat 8-year-old Michael Richardson from Queens. He wore his best church clothes, white shirt carefully ironed by his mother that morning, clip-on tie slightly crooked, hair combed with water that had long since dried. In his hands, gripped with the intensity that only children possess when carrying something precious, he held a white envelope bearing Ed Sullivan's name in careful, oversized handwriting. Inside that envelope lived words that would shatter 16 years of legendary control and transform live television history forever. The cameras went live at 8 o'clock sharp. Ed Sullivan delivered his opening monologue with characteristic authority, his voice carrying that distinctive nasal quality millions of Americans could recognize in an instant. He introduced the first act, a comedy duo whose routine had been polished through 3 days of rehearsal. The studio audience laughed on cue. The cameras captured every angle. Everything proceeded exactly as the script demanded. During the first commercial break, Ed moved through the studio with practiced efficiency, checking on upcoming performers, conferring briefly with his director, maintaining the forward momentum that kept live television from collapsing into chaos. He'd done this 747 times before. The routine was muscle memory now, instinct replacing conscious thought. The show continued through its second and third acts without incident. A singer delivered a Broadway number. An acrobat performed feats that drew gasps from the audience. The commercial breaks came and went with mechanical precision. By 8:17, Ed Sullivan and his crew were executing another flawless broadcast, another Sunday night of controlled excellence. Then, during a commercial break that should have lasted exactly 2 minutes, Michael Richardson stood up from his front row seat. His mother reached for his arm, trying to hold him back, but the boy moved with purpose that surprised even her. He'd been quiet all evening, watching intently while other children fidgeted and whispered. Now he stepped into the aisle and walked directly toward Ed Sullivan, who was heading backstage to prepare for the next segment. Ed turned and found himself facing a small boy in a crooked tie, holding out a white envelope with both hands like an offering. His first instinct was pure professional reflex. This was a breach of protocol. Studio audiences didn't approach the host during broadcasts. Security should have prevented this. A stage manager moved to intercept, but Ed raised his hand, stopping him mid-stride. Something about the child's expression held him. The boy wasn't excited or starstruck like the children who usually attended the show, hoping to glimpse their favorite performers. His face carried something else entirely. Something older, something careful, something that looked almost like responsibility. "Mr. Sullivan," Michael said, his voice steady despite obvious nervousness. "I wrote you a letter. My teacher said if I wanted you to read it, I had to give it to you myself." Ed glanced at the commercial countdown clock mounted on the studio wall. 90 seconds until cameras returned live. Every instinct he possessed said to smile kindly, accept the letter, hand it to a production assistant, and return to his mark. That was the professional response. That was how you maintained control. That was how television worked. But Michael Richardson didn't step back. He stood there, envelope still extended, and said 6 words that changed everything. "It's about my sister. She's dying." The word hung in the studio air like something physical. Around them, crew members froze mid-motion. Stagehands stopped adjusting equipment. The makeup artist holding powder and brush looked up sharply. Ed Sullivan, who had faced every conceivable situation in 16 years of live broadcasting, felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. His carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. "She has leukemia," Michael continued, his child's voice taking on the careful tone of someone delivering a message they've rehearsed many times. "She's 6 years old. She wanted to see the Beatles last week, but she was in the hospital. The doctors say she's getting worse." Ed looked down at the countdown clock. 60 seconds. He should redirect this moment, express sympathy, promise to send an autographed photograph, return to the show. The audience was waiting. The Beatles were waiting. 73 million American families were waiting for him to maintain the perfect Sunday night ritual they'd come to expect. Instead, Ed Sullivan did something he'd never done in 748 episodes of live television. He knelt down to the boy's eye level, right there in the studio aisle, his knee touching the cold floor, and opened the envelope. "Tell me about your sister," he said, and in that moment the countdown clock became irrelevant. The script became irrelevant. 16 years of professional control became irrelevant. Inside the envelope, 3 pages in a child's careful handwriting. Ed's eyes moved over words that 8-year-old Michael had written at his kitchen table, probably with his mother helping him form the harder sentences, probably late at night after visiting his sister in the hospital, probably with tears falling onto the paper as he wrote. What Ed Sullivan read in those 3 pages would ensure he never controlled another broadcast the same way again. The letter began with the formal politeness of a child who'd been taught to respect adults. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, my name is Michael Richardson. I am 8 years old." But as Ed's eyes moved down the page, formality gave way to raw, desperate hope. written in uneven letters that grew larger and more urgent as the message continued. My sister Katie is 6. She loves the Beatles more than anything in the whole world. She knows all their songs by heart. She wanted to watch them on your show last Sunday, but she was too sick. She is in Memorial Hospital. The doctors say she might not get better. Ed looked up at Michael, who stood perfectly still, watching the man who controlled American television read words about a little girl dying in Queens. A production assistant appeared at Ed's shoulder, whispering urgently about the countdown. 30 seconds until cameras returned live. Ed waved him away with unusual sharpness that made the assistant step back in surprise. Does Katie know you're here tonight? Ed asked. Michael nodded, his composure finally beginning to crack. I promised her I would try. She made me promise. Ed returned to the letter. The final paragraph had been written with such careful pressure that the pencil had nearly torn through the paper. I am writing to ask if there is any way Katie could meet the Beatles, or if they could say hello to her on TV. She talks about them all the time, even when she's very sick. I think it would make her so happy. Please help if you can. Sincerely, Michael Richardson. Paperclipped to the letter was a school photograph. A little girl with blonde hair and pigtails, missing her 2 front teeth, smiling with the unconscious joy of a child who didn't yet understand what leukemia meant or why she spent more time in hospitals than in playgrounds. Ed Sullivan stared at that photograph for a long moment. Around him, the studio had gone completely silent. Crew members who'd worked these broadcasts for years had never seen Ed ignore a countdown warning. They'd never seen him kneel in an aisle. They'd never seen his hands tremble the way they were trembling now as he held a child's letter and photograph. The cameras were waiting. America was waiting. But Ed Sullivan had just made a decision that would define his entire career. Ed stood slowly, still holding the letter and photograph. He looked at Michael Richardson, this 8-year-old boy who'd traveled from Queens, navigated his way into a studio audience, and stepped forward during a live broadcast, carrying his dying sister's hope in an envelope. Not for himself, for her. A child shouldering the weight of another child's last wish with a courage that most adults could never summon. In that moment, Ed Sullivan confronted something that existed beyond television mechanics, beyond professional protocol, beyond the careful choreography that kept live broadcasts from collapsing into chaos. Here stood pure love in its most devastating form. A brother's devotion powerful enough to make him approach a stranger on live television, risking embarrassment and rejection because he'd made a promise to his sister, and promises meant everything. Ed had interviewed war heroes who'd thrown themselves on grenades to save their platoons. He'd spoken with parents who'd lost children and somehow found strength to continue living. He'd maintained composure through every conceivable human story, treating each with the same professional respect that made him legendary. But something about this boy's quiet bravery, this simple act of brotherly love, this family's desperate hope expressed in 3 pages of careful handwriting, broke through every defense Ed had spent 16 years constructing. He turned and walked directly onto the stage, letter and photograph still in his hands. The director's voice crackled through headsets, confused and urgent, asking what was happening. Stage managers exchanged panicked glances. The Beatles, waiting backstage for their cue, looked at each other in bewilderment. In 748 episodes, Ed Sullivan had never walked onto the stage during a commercial break holding something that wasn't part of the script. He signaled the director to keep cameras off him for another moment. Then, he did something that violated every rule of live television. He made a decision with no preparation, no approval from CBS executives, no rehearsal or safety net. He was about to take the most controlled show in television history and surrender it completely to unscripted human feeling. When those cameras returned live in 20 seconds, Ed Sullivan would do something that had never been done before, and 73 million Americans would witness the moment their unflappable host became utterly, devastatingly human. The countdown reached 0. The red lights blazed on. Ed Sullivan stepped into history,